Speaking about locusts, we could also recall that they were used by John the Baptist for food. That was written not in Hebrew, but in Greek, but still he lived on locusts and wild honey. Yes, locusts were really eaten. It was the food of the poor. They made flour of them, mixed it into their bread. But there is another version of what John lived on. What are those other versions? They were put forward by very well-known church fathers, Saint Athanasius the Great and Saint Isidore of Pelusium. Isidore of Pelusium says, for one, that the locusts that Saint John the Baptist ate weren't living creatures looking like beetles as something due to their ignorance, God forbid, but tops of grasses or other plants. Saint Athanasius believes that the acrides, that's the Greek word traditionally understood as locusts, stands here for a plant dubbed grasshopper or locust. As an argument, Saint Athanasius adduces Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 5, when the almond tree blossoms and the grasshopper drags itself along and desire no longer is stirred. We can see that in the English translation, but in fact the word desire here is used to substitute for the word for the caperberry, which was believed to stimulate desire. So we find the grasshopper in company of two other plants. That's why Saint Athanasius holds that the word grasshopper goes here in a figurative sense. If so, it implies a plant that John ate. Where is the truth? Who is right? It appears to us that the truth will only be revealed if we understand what kind of honey John ate. Matthew calls that honey wild, agrion. No one pays attention. People see that word honey and associate it with ordinary sweet beehive honey, and they say to themselves, oh, John comforted himself with honey at least. Why, honey is delicious. In vain, because cultured beehive honey and wild honey from mountains or fields aren't quite the same. Strong's Concordance translates the Greek word agrion as wild, but it has added a number of additional meanings: wild, savage, fierce. That's exactly what John the Baptist's wild honey was like. It wasn't just wild, it was also savage and fierce, because untasty. Even more, it was bitter and disgusting. That's just the kind of honey Winnie the Pooh was scared of, like fire. Athanasius the Great says wild honey was very bitter and loathsome to taste. Isidore of Pelusium writes absolutely the same. He calls wild bee's honey very bitter and disgusting. The medieval Greek commentator Euthemius Zigabinus agrees with the Holy Fathers in his opinion on wild honey. He says wild honey is bitter and unpleasant. So, St. John consciously lived on untasty food. Why the Baptist did that is a different question. The most obvious answer is to humble down his flesh, but we aren't concerned with his goals, we are after meanings of the words. What did he eat? Locusts or some vegetable food? If we follow the text of the New Testament literally, we can see that those were locusts, acrides. But if we consider that the Baptist consciously chose untasty, bitter, unpleasant food, then the locusts and the wild honey can stand for any desert food, tops of plants, carob pods. Besides, this word acrides could have another meaning which wasn't as obvious, like we, for example, call a common flower lion's tooth, which is the literal meaning of the word dandelion in French. We also have colt's foot and heart's ease. The writers of old, whose native language was Greek, understood that quite well. By the way, there was another version of the word acrides. In some early manuscripts, it is changed to encrides, which meant flat breads. The copiers must have thought that there was a mistake in the scroll they were rewriting and decided to correct it according to the context.